Today we have another amazing show. We try to bring on really knowledgeable guests and guests who have expertise that, I would say that are not highly represented in the mainstream media narratives. And our next guest, you couldn't be more perfectly sort of censored or isolated than Greg Wrightstone and the CO2 Coalition. Greg is a scientist. He's written the book Inconvenient Facts, which challenges the Al Gore movie, Inconvenient Truth, and brilliantly breaks down all the points that were mistaken, wrong, or completely off in that film. And I know climate alarmism is coming. The new Death Star approach is global warming. And if you challenge that, you get shouted down, and what are you, a lunatic and a climate denier? Well, Greg's a scientist, and he doesn't go along with slogans or consensus. He goes along with where the facts take him. And so I am really grateful that Greg and his coalition, the CO2 Coalition, are going to be speaking here on the airways of WIOX. Greg, welcome so much to Through the Looking Glass.
Oh, I'm very flattered. Thank you so much. We're trying, but we're being stifled and censored and silenced. The best example of that was just recently we added Dr. John Clauser to our board of directors. He's the current Nobel laureate in physics. He was invited to speak 2 weeks ago to the IMF, International Monetary Fund, on climate models, and he had planned to expose their failures, most specifically their failure to include clouds. It sounds pretty basic, but they don't include clouds in their climate models.
When I was 6 and I did some drawings, I made sure to include the clouds in the sky, so I don't know what's going on with these folks.
I mean, clouds reflect depending on the day and the time, and they change quite rapidly and significantly, but they can reflect up to 75% of the incoming sunlight. What's heating the Earth? Sunlight. And if you don't take into account clouds... But anyhow, he was invited, and the night before he was to present his webinar, he was canceled. The head of the IMF said, no, we're not having a science denier. And they called him a science denier. The current Nobel laureate in physics. So we're being silenced. I've been banned permanently from LinkedIn for posting scientific fact. And in fact, my very last post, they started removing everything that I was posting, calling it false and misleading. My very last post, I said, I think I'm about to be banned and deplatformed from LinkedIn. They removed it, called it false and misleading, and then they banned and deplatformed me.
Oh my.
It's kind of funny, but you got to laugh, but there's not much else you can do.
It's terrible. I mean, we saw this with COVID, too. I know Dr. Robert Malone, who helped invent the mRNA technology. You had Dr. Peter McCullough, the most published cardiologist in the world. And on, these stories of people who are mainstream, orthodox scientists and physicians who just had a different narrative and looked at facts and said, no, I don't think this is right. I think whether it be, we can take ivermectin, or whether it be we haven't experimented enough with the mRNA vaccines and what they can do long term. Whatever the reason was, lockdowns are bad. They were dismissed, silenced, canceled. I was like, why can't anyone just debate them and then, show the world they're wrong? And I feel the same with you. Your book, they wouldn't debate you, but you took on Al Gore's book with your book, Inconvenient Facts, and it couldn't be clearer, Greg.
Oh, that's true. And you'll be pleased to know, you don't know it, but you're about to. I've just completed my second book. I sent it off, the last portion of it, to my editor for editing just last night. I have the final summary to do, but the title of this new book, and it really summarizes what we believe at the CO2 Coalition. The title is A Very Convenient Warming, How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. And that's the truth. It's the biggest untold story of the late 20th and early 21st century is this thriving planet, thriving ecosystems, and how humanity's benefiting from more CO2 and modest warming. We should be celebrating what I call the miracle molecule, CO2, carbon dioxide. They call it the demon molecule. But more CO2 is greening the earth. Forests are expanding, deserts are shrinking. We're breaking records of crop growth year after year after year, from the coldest to the warmest nations. And we're seeing a huge increase in vegetation worldwide, from the near polar regions to the equator, are benefiting from warming and more CO2. And we just don't hear that.
Well, it's funny, as a kid, you saw the little photosynthesis diagram, and it was oxygen coming out of the plants and CO2 going in, and it was this perfect cycle. It was harmonious. We supported the plants, they supported mammalian life and other life, and suddenly that innocent little childhood graphic in a science book is, CO2 is now Darth Vader, of the elements. When did this start, and how did you react when you first heard this narrative emerging?
Well, it was really in the late 70s, started with James Hansen. They brought this up. If you remember, in the late 70s, I was in school then. We were, as a geologist, we were being told that it was likely we were going into the next, not maybe not an ice age, but a little ice age, similar to what the Earth experienced in the years from 1250 to 1850. It was called the Little Ice Age. And because we'd gone through 33 years of cooling, and that all changed. It turned around in the late 70s with a big spike in heating, and where it started warming up. And then they were able to link that to carbon dioxide. Why they're doing it, I don't know. It's certainly, if you're going to bring down the capitalist system in the Western world, the best thing you can do is to attack fossil fuels. And we need fossil fuels for reliable, abundant, affordable energy. And what they want to do is replace that with unreliable, unaffordable, restrictive energy that's not reliable at all. And so that's when it started. And I got interested in this as I started learning more. I knew that some of what we were being told about climate change was just wrong as a geologist. In particular, this idea of ocean acidification. They say that our oceans are acidifying. Nothing could be further from the truth. The oceans are quite basic. It's about 8.0 or so. If you recall, 7 is neutral, and anything lower is acidic. The oceans have never been acidic. They're not going to become acidic. They didn't become acidic when CO2 levels were nearly 10 times what they were, 15 times what they are today. And I knew that was wrong. I suspected other things. And so Inconvenient Facts, my first book, was the result of my own personal search for the truth. And I went back to the base. I said, I'm going to look at the very base data myself. I'm not going to rely on anybody else. I'm going to see what the data tells me. And that search for the truth and the exploration, looking at the data, frankly, it angered me. Because what I found was that there's so much misinformation. I guess there's no other way to say it, we're being lied to by scientists. And definitely the media. The media don't know any better, and they're being paid to lie by some deep-pocketed people like Bloomberg and Soros and the rest to promote these climate lies, to spread this climate of fear. And that's what drove me to write my book and expose this, and that's what we've been doing. Then I joined the CO2 Coalition as executive director beginning in 2100, and it's been a great experience. We're seeing people rallying to our cause. People are thirsty for the information we provide. It's information they haven't heard. Part of this you can get is my smartphone app that I developed. It's been downloaded well over 100,000 times. Just go to the Google Play Store or the App Store and search for Inconvenient Facts. It's free. I'm not making any money on it. We're going to be developing a similar one for the CO2 Coalition. But you can have the information in the palm of your hands, the information that shows temperature through thousands and millions of years. It shows fire has been in decline in the United States and worldwide. There are 20% as many fires today as what there were 90 years ago.
Wow.
And there's just so many of these things that we're again, deserts are shrinking. You can learn with this. So Inconvenient Facts smartphone app is a great resource, along with the book Inconvenient Facts, and I've got a second book that hopefully will be released in late September, early October.
And tell us the title of that one again, Greg, the new book.
A Very Convenient Warming, How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. It's not available. I've got to build the website yet and get that out there.
I think it's wonderful what you're doing, and I want this word to get out because I think it is so important. People don't think, it's almost like a lie too big to fail, right? It's like you're so far from the truth. You're saying CO2 is this incredible gift, and we're being told it's this horrible curse that's going to end life on this planet. We have to get rid of it, like net zero. Like, I don't know what that means because humans exhale it. Does that mean we got to get rid of humans as well? On some level, that's farcical that I'm saying it. But if you look at some of the items that they have planned and strategies of getting rid of gas cars, gas stoves, closing farms down in the Netherlands because the cows produce too much methane, and they use nitrogen in the soil, which now nitrogen is terrible, and they just create so much fear. But they're going to create a lot of hunger too with that fear, and we saw that in Sri Lanka. I wonder.
Yeah, it's just you were talking about photosynthesis. Think back to middle school, like you said, it's water, sunlight, and CO2, and the more CO2, the better for photosynthesis. And what they're doing really is promoting an anti-human agenda. They want to, when it comes to agriculture, think about it. They want to decrease CO2, which would lessen crop growth significantly. They want to get rid of nitrogen fertilizer because of nitrous oxide, which is a very weak greenhouse gas. CO2 is also a very weak greenhouse gas, but nitrous oxide in its warming potential pales. It's just minuscule. They want to get rid of nitrogen fertilizer. It's thought to be responsible for more than 30% of crop growth since the 1950s. And then there's plans to do geoengineering to block sunlight. They just floated that plan a few weeks ago, which again would decrease crop growth. All of these things combined will lead to just crop failure, famine, and probably starvation on a global scale not seen since what's called the Little Ice Age, where during that period up to a third of the population of the world perished because of famines and other matters related to the cold. And that's what it looks like they're trying to get us to. So again, I call it an anti-human agenda. They want to increase our electricity costs all over this fear of warming. They tell us that heat waves will kill, and Biden just last week, President Biden said that heat waves kill more people than any other weather event. That's just factually incorrect. We know that cold, temperature-related deaths, cold kills anywhere from 10 to 20 times as many people as heat. And it's documented. It's very, very well documented. There's no dispute that cold is the biggest killer when it comes to temperature-related deaths. In fact, a recent study, I've included this in my book, looked at this, and they concluded that cold kills 9.5 times as many people as heat, and that heat waves, while they do kill, they called it a harvesting event. It seems that heat waves take those near death, and in this study, they actually saw mortality in the weeks after a heat wave actually declines, because those that were on death's doorstep perished during the heat wave instead of a few weeks later. And so they called it a harvesting effect of those near death, which I thought was fascinating. And it's just completely opposite of what we're being told. In fact, and also, if we look at this notion of heat, you probably are aware or have heard of this 1.5 degree. We can't let it. We can't. We have to get. We can't let it get to 1.5 degrees of warming, of Celsius warming. Well, what that refers to is 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Let's just say 1750, and we've already seen 1.2 degrees of warming. So what they're warning us about, and we should all live in fear of 0.3 of a degree Celsius. That's 0.5 degree Fahrenheit. That's what That's what they're saying. We can't allow it to warm 0.5 of a degree Fahrenheit. If the office or the studio you're sitting in right now warmed or cooled by that much, you would never know it.
Exactly.
It's below the thermostat. Won't be triggered on or off by 0.5 a degree. And if you're that worried about 0.5 of a degree Fahrenheit of warming, move 17 miles further north, and it'll be 0.5 of a degree Fahrenheit on average cooler.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's
the problem.
Ludicrous.
Well, you mentioned this sort of global cooling period between 1944 and 1979, and that really stuck out for me because Al Gore has this graph in his film Inconvenient Truth, and it's this 10 times the size. He has to get up on a ladder or a lift to show how bad it is. But he has, since I think around 1870 or 50 or something, temperatures rising, like shooting up, and then what's shooting up with it? CO2. So he goes, see, look what's happening. But we know temperatures did fall globally fairly significantly from 44 to 79. And that was a period of the post-industrial boom in this country. We were so productive after the war. The world, maybe China, exhibited that in the early 2000s, but we haven't seen such growth in such an increased output of carbon dioxide, and yet it got cooler. So right away it smashes that whole myth, and yet, and anecdotally, I remember being a child growing up in the Boston area, and we skated every winter. We had multiple ponds, rivers would freeze. Now, my family that lives there says, the ice was rarely frozen, maybe a couple of days a year. Last year there was no ice. That's an anecdotal response to it, but I remember the ice would be frozen for months in the 70s.
Yeah, and we are in a warming trend. It's warmed a bit. Like I say, it's warmed 1.2 degrees Celsius over the last several hundred years. It's warmed about a degree since 1900 of Celsius. So yes, it's warming a little bit, but we've seen other periods of warming too. And we should celebrate that. And when you say about you remember those cold winters, in the bigger picture, for example, if you go to Mount Vernon, I'm sitting in Arlington, Virginia, and just about 20 miles to my south is George and Martha lived at Mount Vernon. Every winter, he sent his workers and slaves down to the Potomac to harvest ice. They would cut through the thick ice that might be 6 or 8 or 10 feet thick, and they would haul the blocks up. And he's got an ice house there. You can go visit right now. Well, the Potomac only freezes over maybe once every 20 years now. That's just a great example, and it did every year. It didn't froze solid, but it was thick ice, thick enough for them to go out with their wagons on the Potomac and harvest this ice. So we are in a warming trend. There's no doubt about that. But these things are cyclical. I call it the current or modern warming trend. There were 3 other great warming periods dating back to the first great civilizations. The first was the Minoan warm period, or the Bronze Age. That was the time of the first great civilizations: the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Harappan civilization in the Indus River Valley. These great civilizations and empires thrived in this much warmer period. They were growing a crop called millet in Scandinavia, which can only be grown today in subtropical areas. We know, just based on both historical and scientific data, that it was a lot warmer then. And great empires thrived, food was bountiful, and then it started getting cold. And what we see is this repeated story of warmth, great empires, great civilizations, bountiful food, and then it would start getting cold, and we had crop failure, famine, pestilence, and mass depopulation. And when it started getting cold then, it was called the Late Bronze Age collapse. And if your listeners are, you could Google that, Late Bronze Age collapse, see what you learn. Within 50 or 100 years, all of these civilizations collapsed because of lack of food. And Dennison, if you were an emperor, and I think you make a pretty good one, in a warming period, you could feed your subjects. Everybody loved you. But if you were in a cooling period and your crops failed and you couldn't feed your subjects, well, you were in a heap of trouble, because they'd be coming after you with the pitchforks. And that's what we saw. We saw these great civilizations collapse. The Greek Dark Ages, the Dark Ages, the Little Ice Age, all of these periods were very much cooler than the beneficial warming of the Minoan, Roman, and medieval warm periods. And again, with history, if we view history, we see a strong relationship between the rise and fall of temperature and the rise and fall of civilizations. And it's just opposite of what we're being told.
Right.
We're being told, fear the heat. No. History tells us, welcome the warmth, fear the cold. Because cold has always historically been really, really, really horrific.
Well, we were tropical creatures from go. We evolved with fire and clothing to move further north, but it's not our natural existence.
Exactly.
Folks, we're talking to Gregory Wrightstone. Gregory is a geologist. He is the executive director of the CO2 Coalition. You can go to the website, co2coalition.org. It's got amazing intellectual giants on that site who are members. You must be very proud of, Greg, of all the people who've come in, including Professor Clauser, who came in recently.
It's a real honor to lead this group. I'm so happy. I'm a geologist, a simple geologist, and I get involved in these discussions. I stay on the sidelines and just shake my head when they talk about 2N radiative transfer and these things. I'm not a physicist. We have many of our members and on board are physicists. In fact, not just physicists, but these are world-class physicists like Dr. Will Happer, emeritus professor of physics at Princeton, Richard Linson, emeritus professor of physics from MIT. And it's just, they're incredible people.
I had Professor Linson on here twice before, and he made an interesting point. He said around 2010, all the money for grad students was going in. If you tried to come up with a paper that said that Earth wasn't warming in a dangerous, alarmist way and that CO2 wasn't a problem, you weren't going to get funding. And he was saying how expensive science is to conduct. So if you don't have the funding, and the funding's coming from the government, and the government's not going to fund you, if you go against the narrative. And so, you hear John Oliver on his little late night show making a comedic bit about he's got a climate, quote, realist, someone who's not that concerned about CO2 on the show, and he calls in 96 other people onto the stage saying, 96% of scientists believe that climate change is real, and Linson was saying, science is not consensus, it's not a popularity contest.
It is, and it isn't, and it's, That was from Michael Crichton, the talented author. His quote is, "There is no such thing as consensus science. If it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus." Or Richard Feynman, Nobel physicist, "I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. That's actually my favorite.
That's a great one.
Quote. Let me just repeat that. I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned, which is what we find today in this climate alarm argument. There is no debate because they don't allow us to debate. We're going to look back at this period. The scientific communities should be ashamed now, but they will be at some point in the future. Truth will win out, and when will it? It will take disaster, a man-made disaster, for us to finally wake up. And it's coming. That disaster is coming. It's going to be self-inflicted. We're going to have blackouts, brownouts. It's not too great of a stretch to think of a societal collapse at some point when it'll be too late. Instead of relying on reliable, abundant, affordable energy.
Well, I remember being in a physics class in college, and the professor, first day of class, says, "What is small enough to fit in a teacup and powerful enough to carry 1,000 pounds for 1,000 feet?" And I was thinking there must be some kind of insect that I don't know about, or microorganism or something. And he said, no, it's oil, basically. And we realized we've been given this gift from nature where we have all, people spent 12 hours a day getting food, water, and heat. And now we can just turn switches or order on our keypad, and all that stuff comes. And people don't realize what's behind that freedom and that convenience.
And Dave, just think about India. They have 600 million people living in energy poverty without electricity. So they're using dried dung and wood to cook over inside their homes. Some 4 million people die a year because of lung diseases because of the particulates. It's horrible. And what our leaders right now want to do, the IMF and others, the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab and the rest, they don't want those people to have electricity. They don't want to allow coal-fired electricity. They want to destine these people to continuing generational poverty because of their lack of electricity. Prime Minister Modi in India is going gangbusters, opening more mines, mining more coal, and building more coal-fired plants because he wants to lift his people up out of generational poverty. And President Xi in China is doing something similar, although I don't think his motives are to help some poor peasant in the remote province of China. He wants to become the world's economic powerhouse, and he knows, again, the three words I use are reliable, abundant, and affordable. He knows he needs energy that is reliable, abundant, and affordable, and it ain't from wind, and it ain't from solar. You only get it from nuclear, oil, natural gas, or coal.
Right. And, one of the great achievements in this country's history by the government was the WPA program by Roosevelt, and the Tennessee Valley Authority came out and gave electricity to Appalachian region of the United States, which was, people were living without electricity up until the 30s and 40s, and some people still had to wait another 10 years to get it in the more remote areas. But what a gift to those folks' lives, what an increase in their lifespan and the quality of life and the education that they receive. And we celebrate that. And today, if someone wants to build a power plant, it's like, you're working for Satan or something.
No, you're right. I like that word, celebrate. We should celebrate our energy from fossil fuels. And it's funny, I look at fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas as the world's. These are natural solar batteries. And why do I say that? Because we know that coal, of course, they were formed from trees that grew because they used the sunlight and water and the CO2 to create great coal swamps during the Mississippian and Pennsylvania and early Permian periods, the Carboniferous period, to lay down huge amounts of coal that use sunlight to do that. And it stored that energy in the form of coal, and same with oil and gas that are created from organic rich muds that were powered by algal blooms that were powered by the sun. So all of these fossil fuels were actually powered by sunlight. So if you look at it, fossil fuels are actually natural solar-powered batteries that have been holding this energy for millions of years, waiting for us to liberate it. And the fact of the matter is, the CO2 levels in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, is at historically low levels. Granted, it's increased by 50% since 1800, and we view that as a good thing. But even at the 420, which is parts per million, it's at historically low levels. The average in Earth's history was 2,600 parts per million, 6.5 times what we are today. Our plants and crops, the forerunners of them, all showed up at times when CO2 was at many times the level it is today. So we're still at suboptimal levels for plant growth. It's better today at 420 than it was when it was at 280 parts per million. Plants are loving it. They're sucking up that CO2, and again, we're breaking crop growth records year after year after year from almost every single crop on Earth is thriving and prospering. And because of more CO2, plants and crops are more drought resistant. They need less water than at lower CO2 levels.
This is fascinating. Folks, again, we're talking to Greg Wrightstone. Greg is the director of the CO2 Coalition. He's got a brilliant book out called Inconvenient Facts, and he challenges and tears apart Al Gore's inconvenient truth and many of the statements and claims in that film. It's very easy to read, easy to follow book. And he's got a tremendous website, the CO2 Coalition, with lots of resources for you to check out. And Greg, we're so grateful you came on to WIOX, because we are live and local here in the Catskill Mountains at 91.3 FM and at MTC Cable Channel 20. And you can listen to us everywhere at WIOXradio.org. And if you like what you hear, it's easy to donate. We're a free, independent radio station in the mountains, and we're able to get people like Greg Wrightstone on, and people who think outside the box and who back up what they say. Greg, I can't help but think that when I hear you talk about all this energy we have, I remember being told that, peak oil is happening. We're going to start running out of oil. We're going to start running out of coal, that we've got to limit it. First argument I heard was we have to limit it because we only have so much left. And then that kind of latched onto the argument, and we're burning the world up too hot at the same time. But it seems like they've been predicting the end of oil forever. And, I've heard others say it's the second most abundant liquid on Earth except for water. We've got plenty. We shouldn't waste it, obviously. We should try to be innovative with alternative fuel. But realistically, you can't really replace the power and the dependability of hydrocarbon energy. What are your thoughts there?
We're awash in oil. And just one example for oil, back in, this was, back 2010, 2008, I was involved with a startup. They were looking at the Middle East for oil fields. The big boys wouldn't look at anything less than 150 million barrel fields because it wasn't worth their time. Well, they're hard to find. There aren't many of those huge, what we call elephants in the world, but there are a whole lot of really smaller fields that just haven't been tapped yet. It takes a little bit higher prices and the wherewithal, the gumption for somebody to go get them. And just to your south, you have 3 giant reservoirs. In fact, I was the co-author of the first comprehensive paper on the Marcellus Shale. Again, to your south, Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and northern West Virginia. We looked at the Marcellus, and again, looking at this, I coined. I was the originator of the term mega giant field, because a giant field's 3 TCF, super giant is 30 TCF, and trillion cubic feet, and I coined the term mega giant for anything that was 300 trillion cubic feet or more. There are only 4 of them of natural gas fields in the world, 3 of them in the United States, and 2 of them are just to your south in the Utica and Marcellus shales in the Appalachian Basin. And we looked at the Marcellus. I hope you're sitting down. Mm-hmm. We looked at the gas reserves of the Marcellus and compared it to the top 10 existing natural gas fields in the world. The top 10 combined didn't equal the Marcellus.
Oh, man.
I mean, that's how big it is. The top 10 conventional natural gas fields didn't even equal what the Marcellus. And there's one underneath it called the Utica that's barely been tapped. Might even be bigger. And then I've written about a shallower one it's a super giant, but it's not a mega giant, but it's still huge. And so you've got these vast reserves. But what's New York and New Jersey done? They've banned pipelines. You can't get the gas from Pennsylvania up to New England where they desperately need it. And so what they're having to do in New England is, and they're not allowed to ship in liquefied natural gas or LNG to Boston because of the Jones Act. The Jones Act requires American flagged carriers and American crude carriers to transfer from one American port to another. We don't have any of those ships. So they've got to buy their gas from Algeria and Saudi Arabia and other places at 4 and 5 times the cost of what they could get it from Texas. It's just stupidity. Joe Biden could change that today. An hour from now he could issue a permit and just get rid. They did it for Puerto Rico for the Jones Act, but he won't do it for New England because they want to import natural gas, and it's horrific. Again, we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
Absolutely, and it's cold in New England, and with prices going up, you don't need your energy doubling and tripling either. Greg, let me just ask you then, you're so familiar with that West Virginia, Appalachia region, you've worked there, studied there. Why is that such a rich zone geologically for energy, coal, natural gas?
Well, it was the Appalachian Basin. My theory is why the Marcellus is just so good is that this. If you don't mind, just a little science here. At the time it was deposited in the Devonian, we had the ancestral Appalachian Mountains off to the east, probably where New Jersey is today. The trade winds were coming in from the east, and so we had this Appalachian Seaway. Today we're Pennsylvania and Ohio and parts of New York, western New York, and as you know, as the trade winds move up the mountains, it drops the rain. On the other side of the mountains, you have this rain shadow effect, very dry, and that was the situation. So my proposal was that there were windstorms that came quite often and blew dust into this ancient Marcellus Ocean Seaway that created algal blooms regularly. And it was those algal blooms that bloomed, died, sank to the bottom, bloomed, died, sank to the bottom, repeated year after year, many times every year, accumulating these organic rich muds at the bottom of the Appalachian Sea, which then turned into and that was later, there might be, in some cases, 20 to several hundred feet thick of this organic rich muds that then were buried and turned into shale, and that are now 6, 8, and 10,000 feet below the surface, and that's why it's so rich. Is this thick organic rich shale that once it's heated up, converts the organic material is converted first to oil. Then wet gas, and then finally dry gas. The hotter and hotter. The hotter area is deeper, and of course, the deeper you go, the hotter it gets. It's called the geothermal gradient, and so the deepest parts are all dry gas with no liquids. As you go west, it's shallower. It wasn't thermally mature enough, and it converted. It's called wet gas. And that gas, when you bring it out, has things like propane, benzene, butane, isopentanes, very, very rich that drop out. And you need that for, say, ethanol, or not ethanol, ethylene. That's the byproduct for so many things we need, plastics and the like.
Greg, folks, you're listening to Through the Looking Glass here in WIOX Radio. We're here Mondays from 9 to 10 a.m. I'm your host, Dennison. We have Greg Wrightstone, geologist and executive director of the CO2 Coalition. Greg has the audacity to believe that CO2 is not this raging Death Star approaching us, but rather it's a gift, and it should be embraced. And he's really disturbed by the current narrative, as are many scientists that are working with him. And you wouldn't know it from the media, but there are scientists out there doing science, ready to debate anyone on the issues. Let me just ask you about the IPCC and the Paris Accords, the treaty there. Most people think, oh, it's so good that the world's working together. All the world is getting together, and we're trying to reduce carbon dioxide as one. You know, there's such a competitive world, and countries are always trying to outdo each other, but we're all together on this, and then, no, we're not. China doesn't have to follow this. Russia doesn't have to follow this. India, Brazil, on and on and on. I mean, it seems like the West is destroying itself while China builds a coal plant every 2 weeks.
Oh, that's a fact. And if you look at what the warming effect of our emissions, it's incredibly small. Even if we went to net zero, we're looking at 0.04 of a degree Fahrenheit of warming that would be averted. We can look at it's incredible.
Wait, 0.04 of 1 degree is what we could avert by some of the measures we're doing today. Is that correct?
Well, let me open up my Inconvenient Facts smartphone app, and on that you can go to the Magic website. And so if we go to...
I'm there now.
Okay.
Yeah. If
you go to the Magic website by 2100... if you averted, I misspoke. Because that 400s would be for a 40% reduction. 100% reduction would get you 1/10 of 1 degree, and that's where the United States went to net zero. You get 1/10 of 1 degree of warming that would be averted for going to net zero. That's barely at our level of be able to detect, and that's assuming that a doubling of CO2 would cause 2 degrees of warming, which we think is about 2 times too much. But nonetheless, whatever the number is, it's incredibly small, and so we're risking our society. And think too, if we look at how many trillions of dollars have we spent, billions of dollars have we spent. And we were 10 years ago, we were at 80, fossil fuels made up 82% of our energy in the United States. Today, it's 81%. So for all that money and all of the money we've spent promoting solar and wind and everything else, it's gone from 82 to 81% of fossil fuel energy. We're just shooting. It's not a comedy of errors. It's a tragedy of errors, and it's just not so. And we've looked at heat waves, for example, are a great example. We looked everywhere we look, we find that heat waves actually spiked back in the 20s and 30s, and it's many fewer heat waves today than there were then. But you wouldn't know that from the EPA website. In fact, writing my book, I went back to the EPA website. If you go to EPA heat waves and go to their page right now, there's a chart there. It's called Heat Index, United States Heat Index for heat waves. Oh, and it was like they used to have a chart showing heat waves going back to the early 1900s, showing that, in fact, during the 20s and 30s, there were 5 and 8 times as many heat waves during those decades than what there are today. They removed that. It's hidden. You can't even access it, and they replaced it with this thing called a heat index. Well, it didn't look right to me because it looks like they've just been accelerating. And I looked into it, and they don't even back to 1980. If you look at that, and I went back deep into the data, and it's for the 50 metropolitan areas in the United States. Well, that's not can't. We know for a fact it's called the urban heat island effect. And what that means is that urban areas have been artificially warmed over the last several decades, and that's what they're looking at. So, which is quite a bit different. Instead of looking at the Catskills 2 miles out of town where you are, they're looking at New York City. They're looking at Buffalo and Albany. What did the temperature do in those cities? Yeah, it's increased a lot artificially because of the urban heat island effect. But they don't state that anywhere on the website. And it's disingenuous, it's misinformation, and it's intentional.
Well, Judith Curry's story, she was a scientist who, I guess, came up with the data that suggested that severe hurricanes had doubled in the last few decades, and she was flown all over the country, speaking here and there, got all this extra funding, became like a superstar. But then someone presented data to her that contradicted her findings, and she changed her view, and she said, I was wrong. And she ended up losing her job, ostracized, nobody wants to fund her, nobody wants to hire her. And it's a perfect example of you just stick with the narrative, not the evidence, the narrative.
Yeah, and we see that time after time. We saw with Dr. Peter Ridd in Australia, who told the truth about the Great Barrier Reef. We saw it with Susan Crockford.
Polar bears, yeah.
Polar bear expert. She lost her job in the university. Peter Ridd was fired from his job because he was telling the truth about the Great Barrier Reef. And the data he presents today shows the Great Barrier Reef is at its record high amount of coral, completely opposite of what we're being told.
100.
And it's just been incredible. We look all over the earth, and by almost every metric we can look at, ecosystems are thriving and prospering, and we should celebrate that. There's that word celebrate that ecosystems are thriving and prospering. We should celebrate that lifespans are increasing, that food is bountiful, and that the warming is actually quite beneficial. These are all, it's a great narrative.
Well, I mean, I've even heard people say that, if we get to 180 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, that if we get below that the Earth's life is in jeopardy. And so it's almost a good thing we're burning these fossil fuels now, because we're raising the level a little bit further from that baseline.
Oh, absolutely. It's thought to be 150 is the minimum threshold for plant life to exist. We nearly got there at the end of the last ice age. We got to 182 parts per million, thought to be some of the lowest CO2 levels that we've been able to find in Earth's history. So we nearly crossed that threshold, which I call the line of death. And of course, if there's no plant life, then there's no human.
Greg, maybe you can tell people again about your first book. Maybe you can mention that, and then also the book that's coming out again, because I'm sure some people have tuned in a little bit after.
Go to Inconvenient Facts, the science that Al Gore doesn't want you to know. Inconvenient Facts. Just yesterday, it was at number 2 on Amazon. Almost got to number 1 again, but we've been at number 1 regularly. People are just loving it. I've got a gentleman. Actually, he's bought over 100 books. I've got a lot of people that do that have bought 20 and 30 books. They just give it out to people. But I'll be joining him. He owns a lodge in Oregon and has invited me out.
Okay.
We're having a big salmon cookout, and he's inviting all of his friends. I'm going to talk to them. Going to take a jet boat up the Rogue River to the lodge, and so it'll be fun. But he's a fan. He loves my book and what I'm doing. So we've got a lot of people like that liked Inconvenient Facts so much that they buy dozens to distribute to their friends and acquaintances. And it's been huge. Again, it was number 1 a month and a half ago on Amazon in 3 categories. My new book it's called A Very Convenient Warming: How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. You can't go anywhere to find it yet. I'm working on that. Finished it up yesterday, actually. I've got to write the summary, and then it'll be done.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you've been sort of censored from certain platforms. Do you feel like your book's going to get a fair shake when it comes out? Did the first one? How were they received by the sort of institutions of the media?
No, I won't get a fair shake. I know that going into it. In fact, my first book, it shot the #1 bestseller. It's probably likely one of the top 2 or 3 books on climate change over the last several years. My hometown, my library, Northland Public Library, back when I was in Pittsburgh, was just 2 miles from where I live. They refused to put it on their shelf. And I asked them, I said, well, please tell me one other book by an author that's in your district within a couple miles of your library that you've not put on your shelves. Well, we're not going to do it. They just refused. And so I've dedicated my second book to them because they reminded me that book banning and censorship is alive and well in the 21st century. It's things like that. No, it's not going to be on library shelves. It's not going to be in bookstores. But we can go around that. I just authorized the 9th printing of Inconvenient Facts last week. We're getting another 7,500 books published to go, and so we're very proud of that. One thing we haven't talked about, well, we still just have a few minutes, is we have an education initiative. We were here at the CO2 Coalition, very concerned about the state of education, science education in America. Our children are being indoctrinated. It's groupthink and indoctrination instead of the scientific method and critical thinking. And so we did something about it. We formed a committee. Most of these are PhDs in chemistry and physics. And what they've done is amazing. We've created, just last month, rolled out CO2learningcenter.com, CO2learningcenter.com. We're targeting charter schools and homeschools, parents. And so we've got scientific comic books, scientific videos, and importantly, we have lesson plans that accompany each one of these. These lesson plans were created by Dr. Sharon Camp, who's our science education advisor. She's a PhD in analytic chemistry, AP science teacher, just retired. She's still an AP reader. So we have these really good lesson plans that are the homeschooling. Parents are just loving them. But the establishment doesn't like us. We were actually kicked out of the National Science Teaching Association's annual meeting in March. They came down and demanded that we were there, paid for our booth. They demanded that we remove all of our materials.
Oh my goodness! See, this is frightening. This is sort of like she's a witch. You don't have to prove anything. You just make your claim, and that's the narrative. And if you go against it, you're sort of crushed.
Well, I'm not a witch.
Well, you float, don't you?
You look like a witch. That's the old Monty Python skit. It's a great one.
It is a great one. Unfortunately, it's reeking its head today with the climate issue. I wish there was a debate. I wish someone would debate you. Are you open to debating scientists who say that CO2?
Oh, sure. I did one in Cornell, but that's because, again, another fan of the book and me has a building named after him there, and he said, I want Greg to debate somebody. So I guess if you have a building named after you, then you throw your weight around and they do it. So we debated, and it was interesting. And others, there have been some debates. Usually they don't, the alarmists don't want to have any discussion because according to them the science is settled and there is no debate. And so just shut up and sit down. We're not going to go away.
Folks, you've been listening to Through the Looking Glass, and we've been very fortunate to have Gregory Wrightstone. That's Wrightstone, Wrightstone. You can find him on Twitter. You can find